is to be endowed with certain tools that you can use to ground yourself, to filter information that you're exposed to, so that you, even if you don't know the provenance, even if you don't know if it's true or false, but you have certain principles in your hand that keep you grounded, so you don't lose yourself. This is a very common phenomenon that we have, where people who have been Muslim, have been Shia their entire life, 50, 60 years, they come across a piece of information that throws them into a crisis. Nowadays, especially, we have, with social media, information is passed around so freely and so carelessly that it seems very common that a WhatsApp message is sent on social media, something is forwarded and sent, that here's a hadith of Rasulullah, here's a hadith of this Imam or that Imam. Do you know that Rasulullah did this, did that? And there's no record of where this is from, what's the source, what's the basis. But sometimes what happens to our Muslims and our Shia in particular is that they are thrown out of whack. All of a sudden they don't know what to do. They feel like, oh, everything I have known has been a lie because look, this thing has been forwarded to me on WhatsApp. That can't happen. If we have strong faith, right, aqidah means that we have our heart tied to certain beliefs. We are anchored, we are grounded in things that are so solid, we're claiming. Right? We always claim is that Islam is logical, it makes sense, it's based in fact and truth, history. The more you dig, the more everything makes sense and you realize this is truth. There are no illusions in Islam. That you have to just pretend, don't look at this, don't ask that. If you ask too many questions, then you won't like the answer. There's nothing like that. The more you understand, the more you get to the bottom of things, the more you see that, I'm in the right place. All this makes perfect sense. So when that's the foundation, we need to tie ourselves to that, and these pieces of information that we get here and there, they shouldn't affect us. They might raise a question for a second that we say, I wonder how this fits in with what I know so far. Let me try to understand this. But not that I feel like I'm in crisis. Yesterday we looked at this story that is tied to the personality of the Prophet's grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. And I critiqued the story, rejected the story, and then also tried to give you some of these anchors, some of these tools that you can use across the board regarding different apocryphal, doubtful stories that you might come across. Today I want to focus on Abdul Muttalib's son, another champion, lion in the story of Rasulullah, and that is Abu Talib. I don't know what your perspective, what your kind of idea is when you imagine what Abu Talib was like. For much of my childhood, I remember, the basis for my understanding of Seerah was this movie, The Message. I don't know if that's outdated now, or do you still watch that? I used to watch it repeated, I had everything memorized. Like now, sometimes I see kids will watch like a Disney movie or this or that, and they have everything memorized. So I used to watch The Message over and over again, and I had the entire movie memorized. That was my first exposure to the Seerah of the Prophet. And so when I think of Hamza, Anthony Quinn's in my mind. When I think of Abu Talib, that character who played Abu Talib, that image is in my mind. So I don't know if that's the case for you all. It's been corrected, I think, in this last generation. A few years ago, this Iranian movie by Majidi, I never know how to pronounce his name. Majid Majidi. So that portrayed Abu Talib in a very different way from The Message back from the 70s. But in any case, let's start with this image because it's an accurate image based on the Seerah literature, what was presented in The Message. So there are, I think, 3 or 4 attributes that you come away with that you think Abu Talib seems to be like this. One attribute that he is always given is that he's mushrik. Right? The general understanding and the way he was presented in that movie as well is that he's mushrik. Lived and died as a mushrik. Another common idea about Abu Talib is that he was poor. He couldn't even afford to support his own family, and he had to get help from family members to support his own family. Another image that is to some extent grounded in literature, but definitely that movie played this up, is that he's weak. Meaning physically, he's an old, frail man that you can barely stand probably, but he seems like a very weak person. The only, the strength that he has across the board, everyone accepts, is he had political strength. Right? He's an elder, he has kind of charisma, and nobody touches Rasulullah because of Abu Talib's stature and his charisma. So that, I think, is portrayed and accurately portrayed. But he seems like a weak character. You couldn't imagine him with a sword. You feel like if he held a sword, probably his hand would break because it's too heavy for him. So these are, I think, three. I don't know. Is this accurate? Like, is that the kind of image that you think is popularly portrayed of Abu Talib? I think that's pretty much how we see him. When you look into the seerah literature, let me give you one piece of information first, one idea first. So the way many of these disciplines of Islamic studies developed, there is some big influential personality, a scholar, who comes along and writes a monumental work in a particular discipline, and that person really sets the stage and sets the tone for what the discussion is going to be in that discipline forever. So in fiqh, for instance, on Shi'i fiqh, Shaykh al-Tusi was this kind of personality. He was such a giant, and he was such a visionary. He was the one who, for the first time, consolidated and presented Shi'i fiqh in a way that the Shia could be proud of. And so once he did his work, now every single faqih since his time follows in his footsteps. So however he organized things, the sequence in which he discusses things, all of that is based on his work and how he organized things. Nobody wants to rock the boat and rearrange things because it seems like, who am I to do that when Shaykh al-Tusi set things in this particular way? And the same thing for other disciplines. So in this field of history, particularly seerah, the personality who did this is, for the most part, a person by the name of Ibn Ishaq, and his seerah was then reworked by Ibn Hisham. So the work of Ibn Ishaq itself is no longer existing, but Ibn Hisham came along and took Ibn Ishaq's work and changed it and edited it and reduced it and reordered it and took out some things that were offensive, and that became the standard seerah text. And so he discusses things in a particular sequence, and he talks about certain things and doesn't talk about certain things, but he set the standard. And so now, since his time, every writer of seerah, every scholar of seerah, Sunni or Shi'i, has Ibn Hisham's Asirat al-Nabawiyah in his mind as the template, and he will simply narrate the same thing, or if he has some new idea, he'll respond to it, debunk it, offer something different or new, but it's basically along the same lines and the same template as Ibn Hisham. The reason why I say this is that so much, we as followers of Ahlul Bayt, we have access to a plethora of information that those who don't see Ahlul Bayt as a source of information, they don't have access to that information. They've deprived themselves of that information. But this information doesn't fit necessarily in the template of Ibn Hisham, of the Asirat al-Nabawiyah. And so what I've found as I'm working through the seerah, there's so much more that we can add to the seerah. There's so many more chapters we need to open up. And because all of this information from Ahlul Bayt has been ignored, we don't really think about it. When we think of Sirat al-Nabawiyah, we don't really think about these pieces of information from Ahlul Bayt. Right? So this is a problem, a challenge. Even if you have Arabic or you have a good translation of a book like Sirat al-Nabawiyah or Al-Maghazi of Al-Waqidi, two of these major works on the seerah of the Prophet, you will still have a limited and maybe lopsided view of what the seerah of the Prophet was. All right, so with that background, let's talk a little bit about Abu Talib alayhi salam. So with regard to his poverty, for instance, the idea that he was poor, one of the main stories that's narrated that indicates that he was a poor person is the story that there was a drought and some economic pressure that came on the people of Mecca. And so some people have a lot of wealth and access to a lot of wealth, so they're not so much affected by a drought or any sort of economic downturn. They have enough of a buffer that they can weather the storm. But the story tells us that Abu Talib was already hard off before, and so when the drought comes, then he is not able to support his family. And his brothers and Rasulullah come to him, Hamza, Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, and Rasulullah. The three of them come to Abu Talib, and they offer to take his 4 sons off of his hands and take them into their own homes to raise them, to relieve him of some of the burden, the financial burden that he is not able to withstand. And so they go to him, and I always mix it up. I think Abbas says, I'll take Talib. Actually, first Abu Talib himself says, leave Aqil with me, his oldest son. He has 4 sons, right? Aqil, and then Talib, and then Ja'far and Ali. And so he says, leave Aqil with me, but the other 3 you can take. And so Abbas, for instance, takes Talib, and Hamza takes Ja'far, or I switched around, I always get those 2 mixed up. And then Rasulullah takes Amir al-Mu'mineen. So this story then is a major story in all the Seerah books, Sunni and Shi'i, and the whole premise is that Abu Talib was too poor, so he couldn't afford even to raise his own sons, his own children. And that Rasulullah basically had to use this excuse of the drought and Abu Talib's poverty as a kind of a trick to get Ali out of this household of shirk and get him into his own household so he could raise him properly. Right? That's the way the story is typically presented. One problem with the story is that the Seerah also tells us that the ages of these 4 sons of Abu Talib, they're 10 years apart. So Ali alayhi salam, if he's 10 years old, this is younger, so you say 7 years old, that means Ja'far is 17, that means Talib is 27, and Aqil is 37. What 27 and 37, maybe even a 17-year-old, is a child that has to be taken out of the home and raised like a little boy and fed and clothed. Why can't they go and earn for themselves and help Abu Talib if they're that old? They must have their own families, their own children, their own households. So there's a discrepancy then in the story that's making it out that Abu Talib can't raise his 4 young children, when in reality they're not 4 young children. Ali is young, but the other 3 are already adults. In that age, in that time period, probably Aqil maybe already had children and grandchildren. Right? So lies, fabrications, they never withstand scrutiny. When you scratch the surface and ask some questions, then things fall apart very quickly. And this is the main story that indicates that Abu Talib was poor. Nowhere else do we have any indication that he was poor. He's not a beggar. He's able to raise his house, raise his family, support them very well. He has a home. He has, the means to raise quite a large family, 4 sons and several daughters as well. And there's no other indication that he's a poor man. So that's one aspect of that image that people sometimes have of Abu Talib that crumbles very quickly. The other is that he's mushrik, that he lives and dies as a mushrik. So this is a very common understanding, especially amongst Ahlul Sunnah, and they stand by this and they insist on it, and they cite certain stories or certain phrases, like Muawiyah telling Imam Ali alayhi salam that my father and your father are both in hellfire. this whole idea of Abu Talib being mushrik is a complete fabrication. First of all, one of the big red flags that we should have in our mind whenever we're dealing with someone like Abu Talib is this propaganda machine of Muawiyah. Right, one of the things that Muawiyah did, and I indicated this the other day as well, maybe it was yesterday, he was very savvy. He was probably, it's not far-fetched to think that he would probably fool many of us if he were alive today. Eloquent, handsome, charismatic, clever. This is one of the reasons why it was so wise for Imam Hassan to have this treaty with him and not go face to face with him and not interact with him more, because you can't win against someone who has no standards, no morality, is willing to do anything. He'll pay anyone off, he'll kill anyone he needs to. There's nothing he won't do. Think of the mafia type of a character. There's no crime that's too big, because there is no God, there is no judgment. Everything is what I can amass and do in this dunya for Muawiyah. So he had a very active and very powerful propaganda machine, and we see this playing out all across the board. If you look at Imam Hassan's engagement with Muawiyah, right, because when Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen died, he was basically trying to go back to Siffin. He was taking his army to go back to Siffin because the whole arbitration, which was a farce to begin with, it finally came out as a farce that Imam al-Mu'mineen already knew anyway. And so he took his soldiers, he said, we're going to go back to Siffin and finish off Muawiyah once and for all. As he was going, then this whole Khawarij uprising happened, and he said, we have to deal with them first before we can go. Once he deals with them, and so many, 4,000 or so are killed, his soldiers become a little bit tired of killing Muslims. And they aren't willing to go with him to Siffin, so he goes back to Kufa, and then he's assassinated by one of those Khawarij that he had left to flee from the battlefield, Abdurrahman ibn Muljam. So when Imam Hassan becomes Khalifa, his first order of business is to go back to Siffin and finish off what Amir al-Mu'mineen had wanted to do before he died. And so he raises the army with much difficulty, and as he sets out, Muawiyah now is much more powerful, much more bold, and he does everything he can and buys off people, spreads false information, does so many things, and he completely guts Imam Hassan's army, and he's left with no choice but to capitulate and sign the treaty. So part of Muawiyah's campaign, this propaganda campaign, is to downgrade the family of the Prophet, to make them seem like ordinary people, to make them seem similar to his own ancestors and his own family, so that people would be able to swallow easier that someone like Muawiyah and the Banu Umayyah can be rulers. Because what's the difference? If Ali's father is a mushrik and my father is a mushrik, then what's so special about Ali, and why should he be Khalifa and not me? Right? So it was kind of trying to bring the personalities and the those things that were important in the Jahili mind, bring them down in those perspectives so that people would feel that it's normal for Muawiyah to rule and to be on par and see himself as an equal to Ali, even smarter than Ali, and so forth. So this idea that Abu Talib was a mushrik it feeds into this narrative very well. But if you look at historical records, we have a diwan of Abi Talib. Abu Talib was a poet, and throughout his life he was writing poetry. It's been compiled by some of our scholars, and the poetry that he writes is very clearly in support of his nephew. He speaks of Tawheed, he speaks of his loyalty to the Prophet, that he's a righteous person, he's this and that. It's full of reference to his faith. We also know that Abu Talib, one of his roles as protector of Rasulullah was to play this very delicate role of pretending like he's only interested in protecting his nephew because of tribal reasons. So he had to act like a tribal chief. The whole reason for that is that if he made it clear that he's also a Muslim, that he's also been affected by his nephew, then he would lose his credibility. He would no longer be able to protect Rasulullah the way he could if he was seen as a mushrik, pagan, tribal leader who's just looking out for the interests of his tribe members. So this is a role that he was playing to serve Rasulullah's cause better. But if you look back in history, this family, remember these are the descendants of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam. Abdul Muttalib, the father, and Abu Talib, the son, these are people who they've been raised in this family. They know the prophecies. They know who is coming, what is in store for them. They have never worshipped idols. They're the true inheritors of this legacy of Ibrahim. They're known as Hunafa. Hanif, Ibrahim al-Hanif, the one who turned away from the false gods of his people and turned towards the true God. Right? The Hunafa were still a known category of people who refused to bow down to the idols. And Abdul Muttalib and Abu Talib were in this category. We have so many ahadith from Ahlul Bayt that talk about even visions that he is shown. Right? Mukashafat, visions that he's shown to see the reality of who Rasulullah is. And even in Sunni seerahs, they will narrate some of these stories. The one famous story that you're probably familiar with is that Abu Talib had taken Rasulullah when he was young on one of the trade journeys to the north, to Syria. In the city of Busra and Basra, they stopped the caravan for a rest at this monastery, and there's a monk by the name of Bahira. And it's a famous story, you probably heard it. And so Bahira, he sees certain signs. And some of the stories say that as the caravan's coming, he sees that there's a cloud that's coming, going over the caravan, giving shade to the caravan. And he sees that this is a sign that Allah has sent some special mercy on this caravan by giving it shade. So he becomes more attuned, and he's more interested to see what's the caravan bringing. And then as he interacts with the caravan, he sees certain signs in Rasulullah that he recognizes because he's attuned to the prophecies of Isa alayhi salam that are prophesying وَرَسُولًا يَأْتِي مِن بَعْدِ اسْمُهُ أَحْمَدُ. I'm coming to tell you about a Rasul who's going to come after me, whose name is Ahmad. The Quran tells us that Isa's prophecy about Rasulullah coming. So this Bahira has those prophecies. He's awaiting, he's muntazir, he's awaiting the final messenger. And so when he sees certain signs, he says, I think this is the one. And he starts to test him in different ways. So he asks Abu Talib, who is this boy to you? And Abu Talib says, he's my son. Bahira looks confused. He says, he can't be your son. Because the prophecy says he'll be an orphan. And Abu Talib says, yes, you're right. He's not my son. His father died, but I treat him like my son because I raised him as though he's my own son. So then Bahira says, that's one sign, that he is the orphan that he was supposed to be. Then he asks Rasulullah, he comes, he says, I know you're from Mecca. I ask you by the right of Lat and Uzza, may I ask you certain questions? And Rasulullah says, these names are detested to me. I can't stomach the mention of these names. Don't mention those names to me. And so then Bahira, he says, he was also testing me. He didn't believe in Lat and Uzza himself. He's a monotheistic Christian. And then he says, in the name of God, can I ask you questions? And then Rasulullah says, ask whatever you wish. And then he asks Abu Talib, can I see his back? And so he moves his shirt and sees the seal, this particular mole on the Prophet's back, which was in the prophecies that he would have a particular mole. And he sees that. And so then he becomes convinced that this is the prophesied prophet. And so then he and Abu Talib exchange notes. He tells Abu Talib that I've received this prophecy and I know this prophecy and he's going to have this and this. And be careful because the Jews and Christians will be his enemies and all of this. And Abu Talib says, yes, I've also received all the same information. And they have a moment of connection. These two people, elders, having received information from two different godly sources. When Rasulullah is not even a prophet, yet he's still a child, a ward of Abu Talib, and they have this connection. So when Abu Talib, even before the Prophet's a prophet, he understands that this is the Prophet, and he's going to be a prophet, he hasn't yet been appointed. Then what kind of a mushrik and kafir is he? And he devotes his entire life to taking care of him. He raises him like his own son. After his mother died, he goes to stay with his grandfather Abdul Muttalib. 2 years later, he dies. The Prophet's 8 years old. He comes into Abu Talib's care. And Abu Talib and Fatima bint Asad raised him not only like their own son, better than their own children. We have narrations that tell us that when it was time to eat, they had trained their children not to touch the food until Muhammad came and he ate first. Once he had whatever he needed, then the kids were allowed to eat. In the night, Abu Talib would be on constant watch to make sure that he was safe, and he would shift around all the children in their beds. So in the middle of the night, he would come, he'd bring Ali and wake up Rasul, call him Muhammad because he wasn't Rasulullah then. Wake up Muhammad, say, you come, put Ali in his bed, take him, put him in another bed, and shuffle people around in their beds. Every night he would do this, so that if any of these Jews and Christians who had bad intention and wanted to kill him came, he wanted them to kill his own son and not kill Rasulullah. Even when Amina gives birth to Rasulullah, she is shown certain visions, and when she shares these visions with Abu Talib, he says, I saw the same. So this is the kind of information that he has been receiving, the kind of training he's been receiving from his own father, Abdul Muttalib, and his grandfather, Hashim. He is a believer before Rasulullah even becomes Rasul. There are some indications about his at his deathbed. I'll say this as well. So this is, I think, a very interesting part of this. So usually, when do we think of his death? Am al-Huzn, the year of grief. So in Sirahs, they typically put that in the year 10. The Medinan period is 13 years, right? From the Bi'tha until the Hijrah is 13 years. But all the Sirah books will say that Am al-Huzn, where Khadija and Abu Talib alayhi salam both pass away, that this is in year 10. But what does that mean if Abu Talib dies in the year 10 and Rasulullah stays for another 3 years in Mecca? And how critical was Abu Talib's presence for Rasulullah to live? The whole idea is that Rasulullah's life was constantly under threat. And we see this in the Sirah. He would not go anywhere without his bodyguards. Everywhere Rasulullah would go, he would have Abu Talib, he would have Hamza, he would have Ja'far, he would have Ali surrounding him wherever he went. If there was ever any trouble, these big, hefty, bouncer kind of guys would be there to defend Rasulullah, to block people, to protect him. And without that, his life was under constant threat. But then the histories tell us that in the year 10, Abu Talib died, and now for 3 years, Rasulullah is able to live perfectly safely in Mecca, and he didn't need Abu Talib. And then the migration happens, the Hijrah happens to Medina in the 13th year. That's the common narrative in the Sirah literature. What you find, we have a hadith from Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. Where he says that Khadija died 1 year before the Hijrah and Abu Talib died 1 year after her. It's kind of a riddle, but if you look at the timeline, so 1 year before the Hijrah, Khadija dies. 1 year after means on the eve of the Hijrah, Abu Talib died. That means the 13th year. So Ahlul Bayt are telling us a different timeline that fits with this whole idea, which is universally understood, that Abu Talib's presence was critical for Rasulullah's safety. But again, one of those propaganda kind of points was to continually sideline Abu Talib. He's mushrik, he wasn't even a believer, he died a kafir. He wasn't obviously that important for Rasulullah's safety because he was able to die and Rasulullah was still safe for 3 years. So all these different things are trying to detract away from Abu Talib's position when his position was in fact critical. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's one story, it's a beautiful story, when the Prophet goes for the Mi'raj. Right, so we have several dates. We're told in one hadith from Imam Sadiq that there were 120 Mi'rajes. It wasn't just one or two incidents. But the two that we know for sure are referred to in the Quran. In Surah Al-Najm, we have one reference to it, and in Surah Al-Isra, we have the reference in the beginning. So the commentators and historians think that these are referring to the two Mi'rajes. And it seems like one of them happened early on, and perhaps in the same year as the Quran was revealed, and then one happened a year later. In any case, in this first Mi'raj that takes place, we're told that Rasulullah it was the month of Ramadan, Rasulullah was sleeping in the house of Hani. Hani is the daughter of Abu Talib. Her name is Fakhta, and she's known as Hani. And so he's sleeping there in her house, he's her guest, and in the night, the angels come with Buraq and they take him for Isra and then Mi'raj. Now, again, Abu Talib's job, this is during the time of the boycott. So they're all holed up in the Shi'b Abi Talib on high alert, guards, it's a very dangerous time. And so Abu Talib, since the Prophet's childhood, he's always been on guard, never sleeps through the nights, always patrolling and shifting people in their beds, even into adulthood. So in the middle of the night, Hani sees that Rasulullah's not there. She alerts Abu Talib and he goes into high alert. He thinks the worst has happened to Rasulullah. So he calls together all the men from Banu Hashim and Banu Muttalib. These are the two clans, cousins, who were both devoted and who supported Rasulullah during this boycott in Shi'b Abi Talib. The same Muttalib that I mentioned yesterday, where we were talking about Abdul Muttalib. So his uncle, who brought Shayba in from Medina and joked that, this is my slave, so everyone started calling Shayba Abdul Muttalib. That uncle, Muttalib, who's the brother of Hashim, he was a very righteous person. And his progeny also, they're basically always treated as Banu Hashim. Even though Muttalib and Hashim are two brothers, so that Muttalib's family are not Banu Hashim, but they count themselves amongst the Banu Hashim. They're always supporting, they sacrifice themselves, they go into Shi'b Abi Talib together with them, and the Prophet treats them as though they're his own family. So he calls together the males from the two clans of Muttalib and Hashim and says, bring your weapons and we're going to go and search for Rasulullah. So he marches in with all these young men, all with daggers hidden, into Masjid al-Haram. It's the month of Ramadan. Even in the mushrikeen, they had the same traditions of staying up at night and doing different kinds of worship. So they're all in the masjid, and he sees all the Quraysh leaders there, and he tells his men, each of you go and position yourself close to one of these leaders, and we'll wait. The habit of Rasulullah is every day before Fajr, he enters Masjid al-Haram to pray. So we'll wait until Fajr. If he doesn't show up, then I'll give you the word and you assassinate the person closest to you. So the night goes on, everyone's waiting for the cue, and Mi'raj finishes, Rasulullah comes back, Hani sees that he's back, she says, my father's worried about you, he's in the masjid. So Rasulullah rushes to go and greet Abu Talib and set his mind at ease. When Abu Talib sees him, first of all, he's so relieved, he goes and he kisses him between the eyes and the forehead. And he tells him that if you had not shown up in the next couple of minutes as Fajr kicks in, I was going to have all these men assassinated. Then he decides, this is to show his strength. This is not some frail, weak person that can barely stand up. To flex his muscles and instill the fear of God in all these people, he tells the mushrikeen what he was about to do, what his plan was. And just to prove the point, he asks all of his men, he says, show them your daggers. So they all take out their weapons, and the mushrikeen are in, they're besides themselves. They can't imagine how Abu Talib could do such a thing. And they feel so fearful of him from that point on. Another instance that shows this strength, there are certain people known as the mustahzi'un. They're referred to in the Quran, Inna kafaynaka al-mustahzi'in. Mustahzi' is someone who mocks and makes fun. So there are certain individuals who, they were intellectually not very mature or strong, but they were staunch enemies of Rasulullah, and they would make fun of him. So for instance, this Hakam, Marwan ibn al-Hakam, we know from he was in the court of Medina when Imam Hussein is called in, right? So Hakam, he was one of those mustahzi'un, and he used to walk behind Rasulullah and, for instance, limp and make all sorts of funny gestures and kind of make people laugh as though he's imitating Rasulullah, but as a caricature. So he would walk in a funny way, he'd make funny faces. So Rasulullah, once he tells him, be like that. And from that point on, he's not able to walk straight. The way he was walking, the way he was lurching, he had to walk like that because he was kind of stuck in that mode because of Rasulullah's prayer against him. He became known as Al-Wazagh, the lizard. That was his nickname. And this is the progeny of Marwan ibn al-Hakam. And then after Yazid dies, then the Khilafah of Muslimin comes into the line of the Marwanid Umayyads. So all the other Umayyads from after Yazid, they're from the line of Marwan. We call them Banu Umayyah because they're Marwan and Abu Sufyan, they're both from Umayyah, but they're two different lines of Umayyads. So like that, there are all these other mustahzi'un.
There is a Tesla blocking the overflow parking lot, so you can move the Tesla, so more cars can park in the back. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat.
So three of these mustahzi'un, they are Uqbat ibn Abi Mu'ayt. He is a vile character. His son, Walid ibn Uqba, is the one who had been whipped for drinking by Rasulullah and then banished from Medina. And then when Uthman took over as Khalifa, because he was related to this Walid ibn Uqba, he appoints him as governor of Kufa. And he's the one who one day at Fajr, he was so drunk that he prayed 4 rak'ah for Fajr. And then he turns around in a drunken stupor and says, did I pray enough or should I keep on praying? That's Walid ibn Uqba. So Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt, he's one of the people that after Badr, he's captured and Rasulullah has him bound, tied, and then executed by Amir al-Mu'mineen. That was a kind of execution that Rasulullah forbade. To be killed sabran, al-qatlu sabran, was something he forbade except for this individual. And two people, they're both in this story. So Uqbat ibn Abi Mu'ayt was one of them. An-Nadr ibn al-Harith was the other one, who's also executed in the same way after Badr. And the other is Amr ibn al-As's father, As ibn Wa'il. So these three individuals are mustahzi'un. These are the people who are mocking the Prophet and make it their business to make fun of him, spread rumors, call him names, just discredit him as much as they can. So we're told that one day Rasulullah was in the masjid praying. He had worn nice clothes. He was in sajda. And these three individuals and a whole group of the mushrikeen, they are just talking, making fun, and then they dare one another. They say, I dare you to go and throw some feces or some entrails or something on Muhammad's head, on his back. So these three individuals, they take up the dare. They say, we'll do it. With great pleasure, they go beyond the Mas'a, between Safa and Marwa, there's a place called Hazwara. That's where they used to sacrifice animals. So it's full of entrails and all sorts of mess there. So they go and they pick up a placenta after birth of a camel, and they bring it over and they dump the whole thing on the Prophet's back. The Prophet doesn't react, continues the sajda. When a bully comes and makes fun of you or does something, if you don't react, it kind of takes the steam out of his fun. Because what he wants to see you react. When he does a practical joke, when he makes fun of you, when he hurts you, if you cry, if you say I'm going to tell, if you run away, if you have some reaction, then he feels happy that I caused some pain. But if you don't react, then it kind of pulls this, removes the steam, and then they feel like that was anticlimactic. So they feel like that. He doesn't react, so they go back. They continue talking with their friends. We're told that a little while later, Khadija al-Kubra and a very small Fatima al-Zahra come into the masjid. And they see Rasulullah in the state covered with all this mess, blood and stink and stench. And they see those men there, they see his state, and they put two and two together and figure out what happened. So Fatima al-Zahra, as a child, maybe 2-3 years old, she runs over to her father and starts to take all this mess off of him and clean him up. Rasulullah makes a dua against all these individuals. By name, he mentions all of them, not only the three, but even the ones who had provoked them. He makes a dua against them, and Khadija and Fatima say Amin. Then the three of them leave, and they go straight to Abu Talib's house. In all this mess, Rasulullah goes to the door, and he asks Abu Talib, says, Ya Ammi, what is my position in the minds of the Banu Hashim, and where do I stand? So Abu Talib brings him in, he gets him to tell the story. He tells one of his servants to go and clean him up and put new clothes on him and bathe him. And he calls Hamza, his brother, and the two of them with Rasulullah all cleaned up, they go back to the masjid. Abu Talib, inspiring fear in these people, he walks in and they're all petrified because they don't know what's going to happen now. He tells Hamza to go and bring some more entrails from Hazwara. He tells all these mushrikeen to line up. And he tells Hamza to take these entrails and to rub it on the face, on the mustache, and on the beard of each one of these individuals one by one, and disgraces them publicly. And then he comes to Rasulullah and says, this is your station in Banu Hashim. If anyone touches you, then this is what I do to them. This is the kind of strength, military strength, physical strength that Abu Talib had. He was not some old, frail man, at least not during most of his life. At the end of his life, maybe he was. That's a natural state that everyone enters into. But this is not how he lived throughout these years when he was the caretaker, the supporter, the protector of Rasulullah. And not just with political strength, that was in its own place. But he had military might. People feared him. They trembled when he entered because he had this kind of power to wield the sword himself, to call his own people to wield the sword for him. And all of this was trained on one thing, which is to protect Rasulullah. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi. We're told that on his deathbed, Abu Talib finally calls together first Banu Hashim, and he makes a declaration of faith to them, and he calls on all of them to support Rasulullah. And then one of the hadith tells us that he even called together the pagan leaders who are still mushrik, calls them together, and finally makes his declaration that I believe. I'm actually a believer, and he says the shahada in front of all of them. Some ahadith tell us that on his deathbed, as he's dying, he says the shahada sometimes orally. Sometimes when he loses his ability to speak, he does this. And the ahadith tell us that he used to sign 63. So back in the we have sign language now, American Sign Language. In the Arabs time, abjad hawaz khutti kaliman, this whole system of rearranging the letters and giving each one value. When we say 786, what does that mean? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. How? Because ba has a value of 2, alif has a value of 1, and so forth. You add up the values of all the letters, you end up with 786. So this was a system that they had of matching up letters with number values, and then they also would translate that onto the knuckles of their hands, their uqud of their hands. And so if they pointed to and did certain things, then that would indicate certain numbers and certain letters. So you can communicate using your fingers by pointing to certain knuckles, and someone will understand what you're saying. So the hadith tell us that for 63, this was a sign. And so a hadith say that when Abu Talib couldn't speak, either because he was in taqiyya, or at the end of his life when he lost the ability due to the encroaching death, he would sign 63 to Rasulullah to show one, La ilaha illallah. That was one of the ways that he indicated his faith. And Rasulullah praises him. He says, communicates from Allah that Allah says that you are like mu'min Ali Fir'aun, that you are like Ashabul Kahf. So you have to know who these references are. Mu'min Ali Fir'aun, who is that? So he's someone who was in the family of Fir'aun, who was a staunch supporter of Musa alayhi salam. But what did he do? He lived his entire life in taqiyya, was in the court of Fir'aun, and made a show of supporting Fir'aun and not having anything to do with Musa. But from that position of power on the inside, he was able to manage things and protect Musa at certain times, dissuade Fir'aun from being able to kill him, all sorts of things. So he protected and helped Musa from the inside. And he was only able to do that because he maintained this facade of being a supporter of Fir'aun. That is actually so much harder than being the same on the outside and the same on the inside. Right? Just like, the opposite, a munafiq also has a very hard time because they're kafir on the inside, but they have to pretend like they're Muslim. They're living a lie. And it's very hard to live a lie. If what you think on the inside, what you say on the outside is the same, then it's very easy. You don't have to worry about who's here now, what did I say before, how do I not contradict myself. You don't have to play all these games to try to manage things. The same for someone like Abu Talib, someone like Mu'min Ali Fir'aun, it's extremely difficult to be in that position of power and have solid faith on the inside, but have to manage your every word and every action and every utterance to protect your own faith, and in their case, even more importantly, to protect the Prophet or the Hujjah of their time. Because their interest was not to protect the Mu'min Ali Fir'aun. He ends up dying. He ends up being killed. He gave his own life for Musa's protection. Abu Talib gladly would have given his own life. He put his life on the line endless times for Rasulullah. He never had the tawfiq of actual shahada, but he was willing to. It wasn't to protect himself, it was to protect Rasulullah that he managed this. Ashabul Kahf, the same thing. They had faith, but they were in the court of the Roman ruler of the time. They had to pretend like they're in the court, that they're serving this ruler, when in their hearts they have solid faith in the one God, not even the corrupt Christianity that had already started to come about with the Trinity. They were monotheistic Christians, true followers of Isa alayhi salam, but they had to hide it. So Rasulullah tells Abu Talib on his deathbed that Allah compares you to Mu'min Ali Fir'aun and Ashab al-Kahf. And for that reason, your reward is double. Because your struggle was so hard, it was so difficult for you to manage these two personas, one of sincere belief and one as a tribal leader, that Allah is going to reward you double for that. So Abu Talib is another one of those characters that we have to honor. Now, alhamdulillah that we are followers of Ahlul Bayt, so we have the inside scoop. But even what we know and what we commonly tell as the story of Abu Talib is less than what he's truly worth. If you are able to delve into ahadith and see how he is praised, what these stories are like, then you truly recognize what an amazing person this was. And you really have admiration for him. He was a hero. And it hurts me so much when our Sunni brothers and sisters will say he's mushrik and he had just a political role and he was just protecting Rasulullah because of his tribal values, and they don't see the depth of the character of Abu Talib. So this is a part of our seerah understanding. It also gives us some of those tools to be aware, to have, be on high alert for the propaganda of someone like Muawiyah, who's trying to undermine personalities. And it happens over and over again. This is the common theme that you see in the common seerah of the Prophet, that all those critical personalities are brought down, including Rasulullah himself, to try to downgrade them, make them seem less prophet-like, less special, less holy, even committing, God forbid, mistakes and sins, to make them seem like there's not much difference between Rasulullah and Muawiyah, for instance. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. In the story of Imam Hussein, I want to focus on two personalities that are often not focused on. I know traditionally you are used to hearing certain stories on certain nights. I don't know how this has been codified, but so this night is only for this particular person. That's in its own place, but there's a disadvantage of limiting yourself like that, then you only know about these 5 or 10 people. But there's so many individuals who play critical roles, who are heroes, that we should know about. And so I like to delve into other people's biographies and stories to understand what their sacrifices were, what their personalities were, so we have a broader understanding of all the people involved in Imam Hussein's movement, not just the people that we're traditionally used to hearing about. So one of the things that you hear about a lot in the story of Karbala is messengers being sent here and there. Right? Imam Hussein is sending messages through messengers to Muslim, to Basra, to Mecca, to all these different places. How does this work? Now we take for granted that we have all these systems in place. Now leave technology aside, even before this technology you had post. So there's already a system in place. If I want to send a letter across the world, all I have to do is put a particular stamp on it, put it in a box, and after a certain number of days it gets to its destination, because all those systems are already in place. But in this time, there's no system like that. If you want to send a message from here to there, you have to find your own messenger and give your letter to him and send him physically to go to that place, and it takes sometimes days or weeks, depending on the distance, to get to that destination. Then they deliver the message, get the response, and they have to ride all the way back and give you the reply. So sometimes in the story, we say, the letter was sent and the response came, and we think, it must have happened 1 day, 2 days. These are weeks that we're talking about between Mecca and Medina and Kufa and Syria and these different places. So these individuals who were messengers for Imam Hussein in particular, these were also, they're not just mercenaries, messengers for hire, that he goes to the market and says, who's willing to do a task for me, I'll pay this much money. And the person just does a job. The messengers that Imam Hussein employs, that he brings into his service, these are his own people. These are people who are as committed, as brave, and as willing to sacrifice everything for Imam Hussein as all those warriors on the battlefield of Karbala. And so it's to our own benefit to understand who these people are as well. One of those individuals is a person by the name of Sulaiman ibn Razin. Sulaiman was a mawla of Imam Hussein, so a client, probably a freed slave, very loyal to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He selects him to take a message to Basra right from when he's still in Mecca. He sends a message to the people of Basra to call them to help and to support him. So Sulaiman ibn Razin is the one who takes this message to them. He takes the message to 5 leaders of the Shia community in Basra. When he delivers the message to them, out of the 5, one of those individuals, his name is Al-Mundhir ibn al-Jarud. He becomes suspicious of who this messenger is. He imagines that maybe this is Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad playing a trick on him to see whether he's loyal to Hussein or loyal to Yazid. And so, to make sure he stays in the good books of Ibn Ziyad, because actually this Mundhir ibn Jarud, his daughter was married to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. So to make sure he stays in the good books of Ubaydullah, he takes Sulaiman and presents him to Ubaydullah and says, this is Hussein's messenger. And we're told that the very next morning, when Ubaydullah was set to leave Basra to go to Kufa, That's the morning where he executes Sulaiman ibn Razin. He crucifies him because he's the messenger of Hussein. The message reaches, so Ubaidullah is leaving on that day. He goes to Kufa, so you can imagine this is about 1 month before Ashura, a little bit more than 1 month. Because Muslim is killed on the day of Arafah. That's about 1 month exactly before Ashura. So this is a little bit more than 1 month before that Ubaidullah killed Sulaiman. So the message gets to the other four. They act on it. They start calling their people. They inspire them. They get their commitments to rise up and go together to Kufa. By the time they finally get their act together, 1 month later, news comes from Karbala that Hussein's already been killed. So this was one of the messengers of Imam Hussein, Sulaiman ibn Razin, who was sent to Basra and who died as a messenger of Imam Hussein, a supporter of Imam Hussein. Another individual is Abdullah ibn Yuqtur. He is the messenger that who goes back and forth between Hussein and Muslim. When Imam Hussein is in Mecca and Muslim is in Kufa, so Abdullah ibn Yuqtur is the messenger. He is actually the same age as Imam Hussein. He's called Lidatul Hussein because he was born around the same time as Imam Hussein. His wilada was the same, so Lidatul Hussein, or Radi'ul Hussein, because his mother was the caretaker who used to take care of Imam Hussein. So they grew up together, they're childhood friends and companions, and now he's one of the strong supporters of Imam Hussein. And Imam Hussein uses him as his loyal messenger to take messages back and forth. So we're told that Muslim tried to send word to Imam Hussein as things were changing in Kufa, and he sent a message with Abdullah ibn Yuqtur. As he's leaving Kufa, a person intercepts him, sees that he's a foreigner, stops him, captures him, and takes him to Ibn Ziyad. When he goes into the court, he presents the letter to Ibn Ziyad, and Ibn Ziyad says who's the messenger who's carrying it. He brings Abdullah ibn Yuqtur in front of Ibn Ziyad, and Ibn Ziyad says, who gave you this message? So again, this Abdullah ibn Yuqtur, these are not hired individuals who say, for instance, I'm just doing my job. I don't believe in anything. I'm willing to throw Hussein or this person under the bus to save my own life. This Abdullah ibn Yuqtur, he says, some woman gave me the message. I don't know her name. I'm not going to tell you. So Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad gives him the choice, and he says that you can either tell me who gave you the message or I will kill you. And Abdullah says, as for the one who gave you the message, under no circumstances will I disclose their name. And as for death, I don't care. Because my Mawla Hussein has told me that the best death that a mu'min can experience is death at the hands of the likes of you. So Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad has him taken to the top of the qasr, of the governor's palace, beheaded and thrown down from there as an example to all. But these are the people who were in the service of Imam Hussein, people who had lived with him, who believed in him, and who are willing to sacrifice everything for him. Some were on the battlefield of Karbala, and we celebrate them and we honor them and do their ziyarah. Others are sometimes unknown, but they're no less noble in God's eyes. Their services to Imam Hussein were also outstanding, and they are shuhada of Imam Hussein, and we owe them our honor, and we hold them up as our examples. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdillah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Help us, Allah, to learn from the seerah of Rasulullah. Help us to honor the likes of Abu Talib and Abdul Muttalib and hold them up as our role models. Help us to honor all of the companions of Imam Hussein and to follow in their footsteps. Ya laytana kunna ma'ahum fanafuza ma'ahum. Salawat ala Muhammad.
Say,